My name is Henry Reasoner, and I am a construction manager for Case Construction, one of the largest firms in our state. Jim Case has built the best and most diverse company in the construction industry. If you need a building, we build it from small one-story offices to 100-meter skyscrapers. If you want a house, we have a house building division. Our road construction division has built more than half the roads in this state and several neighboring states. Currently, I am in charge of the road construction division. I have 2 degrees in civil engineering and construction management and have been working at Case for 3 years. I'm hoping that with a little more seniority and a solid track record, I can move into the construction division as there is less travel and a lot less overnight travel. Jim Case and my father, Andrew Reasoner, both served in the Navy as naval installation builders known as Seabees, which stands for Construction Battalion. They served in the Gulf War. Their mission was to put out fires in the oil fields in Kuwait, set on fire by the Iraqis during the retreat during Operation Desert Storm. They planned to open their own company when they returned home from the sandbox. However, my father began moving towards one of the wells when an unexploded anti-aircraft missile exploded under the intense heat from a fire nearby. My father and 4 other members of his team did not make it out alive. Jim had survivor's guilt. He was supposed to lead that team, but he was receiving treatment for a burn on his arm, and Dad volunteered in his place. After they put out the fires, Jim returned home. He promised my mother that she would be provided for, just like I, his only child. Jim soon became an integral part of our home. He took care of the lawn, removed snow, took out garbage, and made all the necessary repairs. He was able to take advantage of the GI Bill and veteran status to obtain loans with low interest rates. He bought out a small company whose owner was retiring. He left the original crews and focused on building houses. His houses were simply the best in the area, and his reputation grew. He saw an opportunity in developing community housing, and within 5 years became the largest developer in 10 counties. He invested the money he earned with his sweat and blood into purchasing a company specializing in road construction. He demanded that the roads they built meet the same high standards of quality for which his homes were known. He later hired his own architects and began designing and constructing commercial buildings. For 10 years, Case has had an impeccable reputation for superior quality at reasonable prices. He treated the workforce fairly and was respected by union leaders and rank-and-file members alike. Craftsmen wanted to work for Jim Case, and his projects were always completed on time or ahead of schedule and rarely went over budget. Jim Case spent so much time at our house that he and my mother fell in love and eventually got married 2 years after my father died. Jim was a great husband and a fantastic stepfather. I was only 7 years old when they got married, and I started calling him Dad. At first he objected, but his mother told him, "That's what Andy would have wanted." My dad took me to work with him, and I got to know both the construction sites and the offices in the city center. He inspired me to explore this business. He paid for my education and gave me my first job. I started from the bottom, as far as possible given my education. He planned for me to take over the company as soon as my training was completed. I won't hide it, the constant travel was difficult and began to create tension at home. In college, I met Sandy. We dated for 3 years, and I proposed to her right after I started working at Case. Sandy had gorgeous blonde hair, icy blue eyes, and a smile that could melt an iceberg. Sandy always attracted attention. She and I discussed starting a family, but she categorically refused to even think about pregnancy while I was always staggering somewhere. I think I could understand her, although Mom and Dad would have been there to help her. I even went so far as to say exactly that one day, and she responded that it wasn't the same thing. She wanted us to go through this experience together, so she remained firmly on birth control. I worked as hard as I could to get out of the road construction division and be home on a more regular basis. Dad always had a big company picnic on the 4th of July. He gave the whole group a long weekend and organized rides and games. It was truly a family event. Dad treated his employees like family. He provided loans for cars and houses and helped anyone on his team who was struggling. Everyone looked forward to the big celebration every year, and Sandy and I were no exception. Like I said, Sandy was an eye-catcher, and to seasoned builders, she was like honey to bees. However, they knew she was my wife and respected me enough to be polite, even though they drooled and tried damn hard not to offend Dad by courting his daughter-in-law. Except for one arrogant bastard named Dave Rumson. Sandy went to play volleyball while I helped Dad pour the beer. I headed to the court as soon as I finished and saw Rumson grab Sandy's ass twice while they were on the same team. He tried to corner her after the game, but she slapped him and walked away. I spoke with Rumson's foreman. I told him what I saw and said that if Rumson did not improve, he would be fired. I thought that would be the end of it. Jim won a major bid to repair a road about 200 miles from home. It was a government contract, and it included a huge bonus if it was completed before the deadline. If we didn't meet the deadline, the company would have to compensate for the excess costs, and no bonus would be paid. So, needless to say, it kept Dad on his toes and me busier and on the road more than ever. Of course, the constant travel made me and Sandy nervous. I told her that I didn't like it any more than she did, and that I was the one hanging out in cheap motels, eating greasy food at diners, and spending evenings alone. I told her that she has a mom, dad, and friends. My argument didn't mean much to her. It seemed like every time I was home, she spent her time being angry at me rather than spending time with me. I told my dad about this, and he said that if I could keep everything under control and we could finish the job to earn the bonus, he would transfer me to the housing division, and I wouldn't have to worry about travel anymore. He said that he wanted to spoil his grandson. I tried to tell Sandy the good news before heading out on what I hoped would be my last trip. It was November 9, 2018, and we were only 10 miles away from completing the paving, and the weather forecast was favorable for finishing the job 2 weeks ahead of schedule. However, she was so upset that I had to spend the night away from home on Friday that she refused to talk to me at all. She even locked me in the bedroom. So I got up early after a restless night in the guest bedroom and checked out at 3 a.m. I quickly had breakfast and arrived at the construction site at 8 a.m. When I met my foreman, Sam Leonard, I was pleasantly surprised to learn that he and the crew had worked all night and finished paving. All that was left was to collect the signs, cones, and barricades and go home. We did it. I was so delighted that I took the whole brigade out to lunch. I gave Sam $500 and told him the beer, burgers, and wings were on me when they got back to town, and he should take the whole crew to Mulligan's. I used my corporate credit card at the diner to pay for my meal and headed out, canceling my room reservation and picking up my belongings. I thought I'd be home by 6 p.m. and take Sandy out to dinner to celebrate. I called my dad and told him the good news. I asked him to call Connie, our office manager, to make a reservation for 8 p.m. at the Circus, Sandy's favorite restaurant, and order a bottle of the best champagne. I also asked her to order a dozen roses and have them delivered to my house. I gave her my personal credit card information and asked her to make a reservation at the Circus for her and her husband Joe, who is a construction site supervisor in the housing division, and to purchase a $500 gift certificate to cover the evening. She was the heart of the office and deserved it. Shortly after I hung up, I got into an accident that delayed traffic and took me another hour. I returned home at 7 in the evening and hurried into the dark house. Sandy was nowhere to be found. I saw flowers on the table. I realized that Sandy hadn't called me. She always called when she was leaving so I wouldn't worry if she missed my call, and so she wouldn't be disturbed during dinner or a movie. I thought she would be back soon, so I quickly showered and got dressed. By 7:45 I realized I wouldn't make it to dinner, so I called and canceled my reservation. I grabbed a beer and made myself a sandwich, thinking the celebration would have to be postponed. I was sitting at the kitchen table, having finished eating, when I heard a noise in the garage and a distinctly male voice. I knew it wasn't Dad. I always carried a 9mm Taurus pistol for self-defense and put it back on when going to dinner because I felt uncomfortable without it. So I quickly took my weapon out of my holster when I heard the door open. Suddenly, The silhouette of a man appeared in the doorway from the garage to the room with the washing machine and dryer. I aimed at the silhouette's center of mass, removed the safety, and fired 3 times. I heard a loud thud as the body fell to the floor. I started dialing 911 when I heard a scream in the garage that I recognized as Sandy's voice. The 911 operator answered, and I told her that I had just shot an intruder who came into my house and that the body was motionless. I told her that the screams she heard were my wife coming in from the garage where the intruder had entered. She said the police and ambulance were on their way. I immediately went to look for Sandy. Was she hurt? As soon as I saw her, I said, "Honey, are you okay?" She screamed, "You killed him." She ran away from me and disappeared upstairs, where I heard the door to our bedroom slam shut. I was confused. I looked at the body on the floor and saw that it was none other than Dave Rumson. While I was waiting for the police, I called my dad and told him what happened and that I didn't understand why Sandy said that. He told me not to say anything until he and his lawyer, Ken Rosenthal, arrived. I removed the magazine from my Taurus pistol, removed the round from the chamber, locked the bolt, and placed the weapon on the table. I tried to coax Sandy out of our bedroom. I wanted to find out what was going on. Something was wrong. I gave up and went back downstairs just in time to see several guns pointed at me and hear the police shouting, "Hands up, where are your guns?" I raised my hands and followed their orders. I told them that the gun was unloaded and lying on the table with the magazine and cartridge next to it. I was handcuffed and read my license just as Dad and Ken entered the house. That's when my loving wife decided to show up. She screamed, "He killed him! He killed Dave!" She was taken to the kitchen for questioning. Ken told the officers we wouldn't talk until detectives investigated. The officers decided to take me to the station until a decision was made on whether to file charges. I was taken to the local police station where I spent the next 72 hours. When I was interrogated, I was told that my wife said that I killed her friend, whom she invited. She said I must have found out about their friendship and misunderstood their relationship and killed him out of jealousy and am being charged with first-degree murder. I was processed, fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in the county detention center pending arraignment on Monday. On the advice of my lawyer, I said nothing. To say that I was completely stunned by my wife's attitude and behavior is an understatement. I had no idea about her affair with Ramson or anyone else. Although she has repeatedly expressed her dissatisfaction with my business trips and her latest outburst over my trip last Friday, I have never seen such unbridled rage as she has shown since the events of the past few days have unfolded. The pain and humiliation were unbearable. The next morning, when Jarvis arrived, a second interview was conducted after my consultation with the lawyer. Jarvis informed them that I was invoking the law of home defense and, as trained, shot at an approaching, and at that time unknown intruder who had entered the house unannounced and was supposedly inside without permission. Ken applied for bail, citing my strong community ties and lack of criminal history. But it was no use, since the county had never set bail for a first-degree murder case. So I was kept in the county jail pending trial, and I spent 18 difficult months in the county jail awaiting trial before my case came to trial. The district attorney, Angela Cascanet, believed she had a clear case with the eyewitness. Although my wife could not be obliged to testify against me, it seemed that she was more than willing to do so. She refused to communicate with me at all. At his dad's urging, Ken hired the best criminal defense lawyer in the country. Dwight Allen Jarvis was the guy the rich and famous turned to when they got into serious trouble. At our first meeting, I laid out everything I knew, including the fact that I had no idea that my wife was in any way related to Rumson. I told him what happened. That Ramson, who was unknown to me at that moment, entered, and his voice was the only one I heard. I saw the silhouette of what I thought was an intruder entering my house. I feared for my life as I did not know who had entered, and I certainly did not know that he had been invited by my wife, as I had no idea where she had been since midday. She left no notice of her whereabouts and never answered phone calls, either her cell phone or her home phone. I left several voicemails on our answering machine and on her cell phone. I also told him that Sandy was in the garage when the shots happened and could not see the shooting happen. I didn't know she was there until she screamed after the shots. She knew I carried a gun for self-defense. I told him that the work was completed ahead of schedule and about the dinner reservation. I had to cancel my dinner reservation because she didn't come back on time. I was hungry, so I sat at the table and ate a sandwich while waiting for her to come home. It was then that Rumson entered the house alone and in relative darkness. She should have noticed my car in the garage and realized I was home, but I received no warning. I told him I only had one bottle of beer and a sandwich. I told him about all the trips and how unhappy Sandy was, especially about this last trip, about being locked out and the incident at the picnic that I never told Sandy about because she blew it off, and I didn't think about it anymore after I talked to Bill that day. I told him that I had never spoken to Rumson personally and only knew him as an employee of another department. I was not his immediate superior. Although I threatened to fire him, I was not the person to do so. The decision would ultimately be made by Bill if necessary. I told him that my stepfather was informed and supported this decision, if necessary, because this type of behavior would not be tolerated in his company. Jarvis thanked me and told me not to worry and recommended that if the DA offered me a deal, I should turn it down, and that the case was not as certain as she thought. Jarvis was good and cost Dad a lot of money. He hired a team of investigators to thoroughly investigate the relationship between Rumson and Sandy. I gave him permission to search my house and our cars. He worked tirelessly and built a strong case during the 18 months I was behind bars. I felt betrayed by Sandy and tried not to believe that she was cheating on me. Unfortunately, Jarvis was able to find several witnesses who saw them together while I was away. They later testified that their touching, kissing, and hugging was inappropriate for a married woman. Surveillance video captured this, as well as secret meetings at his apartment and footage from the parking lot of a bar they frequented on multiple occasions. I was devastated and broken. Fortunately, Mom and Dad were nearby. My trial began on May 5, 2020. The district attorney laid out her case in her opening statement. She stated that I was in a love triangle, and when I saw my wife and her lover enter the house, I decided to use the state's domestic protection law to get rid of the man who was threatening my relationship and marriage. She said that my wife voluntarily agreed to testify for the prosecution. Mrs. Rose Reasoner had a male friend, but that did not justify the death sentence. She claimed that they did not have a sexual relationship, and if her husband had approached her and expressed his concerns, she would have ended the relationship if they were truly bothering him. She concluded that after the jury reviewed all the evidence presented, they should find Mr. Reasoner guilty of first-degree murder. Jarvis used his opening statement to poke holes in the prosecution's case and slowly began to undermine the credibility of the prosecution's main witness, Sandy. He told the jury that the evidence supported a different version of events, and he would prove that Mrs. Reasoner was in fact in the garage after having sex with the victim and was cleaning up when the shots were fired. There was no way she could have seen the shooting from her position, and her testimony about it was pure speculation. He continued by saying that Mr. Ken's Reasoner had no idea that his wife had engaged in an extramarital affair, much less with the suspect. He added that his client was supposed to be away that evening but returned earlier. He told the jury the evidence would show Mr. Reasoner made several attempts to contact his wife, but was unsuccessful. The police report further stated that no notes or any messages were found from Mrs. Reasoner to Mr. Reasoner regarding her plans for that fateful evening. He concluded that the evidence would reveal that the prosecution's key witness was indeed in a secret sexual relationship with the victim and was lying about the nature of her relationship and what she saw on the night of the events. After opening statements, the prosecution's case began. My Taurus pistol and 3 shell casings were presented as evidence. The medical examiner testified that the fingerprints and DNA belonged to me. She also confirmed that gunshot residue GSR was found on my hands and clothing, indicating recent use of a firearm. She added that she found a positive ballistic match for 2 of the 3 bullets recovered from the body of the victim, Dave Rumson. The medical examiner further testified that after Mr. Rumson's autopsy, it was determined that the victim died from gunshot wounds. The district attorney provided documentation showing that CSI, detectives, the medical examiner, and the medical examiner established and maintained a clear chain of custody. Jarvis had no questions about this. The district attorney then called lead detective Dan Iverson to testify. Iverson testified that he arrived at the crime scene after patrol officers secured the crime scene and handcuffed the defendant, Mr. Reasoner, after reading him his rights. He said the defendant's stepfather and his lawyer arrived before him and advised the defendant not to answer questions at that time. Iverson added that he interviewed a witness, the defendant's wife, Mrs. Reasoner. She stated that she invited the victim to dinner, and they planned to spend the rest of the evening at her home, watching a movie on TV. She claimed that she did not know or expect her husband to be at home. She said Mr. Rumson came in first as she was getting snacks from the car when she heard noises coming from inside the house. She said she ran inside the laundry room when the shots rang out. After the shots were fired, her husband came out asking if she was okay. She said her husband had known about Mr. Rumson's interest in her since the outing, when he instructed his supervisor Sam Leonard to threaten him with his job if he continued to court Mrs. Reasoner. However, Mrs. Reasoner told him that her husband had misunderstood the events at the picnic and that she and Rumson were just friends and he had gone too far. He told the prosecutor he found the unloaded Taurus 9 on the kitchen table, unloaded, with the magazine and cartridge next to it, the bolt in the open position. The weapon smelled of gunpowder, as if it had been fired recently. CSI found 3 9mm cartridge casings on the floor and that the victim had 3 gunshot wounds to the chest. He added that based on the evidence, he decided to detain the accused Mr. Reasoner for questioning and later decided to arrest him for first-degree murder. He testified that, according to the accused, he saw an unknown man entering his house, and the silhouette did not allow him to see his face. The defendant claimed he feared for his life and defended himself by firing his 9mm Taurus pistol 3 times at the victim in self-defense. The gun was registered and legally owned by Mr. Reasoner for protection, and he invoked the Personal Protection and Security Act, also known as domestic defense, and categorically denied knowing the identity of the victim at the time of the shootings or that he was invited by his wife. When the prosecution finished their questioning, Jarvis began questioning the detective. He asked Iverson why he decided to charge me with first-degree murder. Iverson told the court that the final decision was indeed made by the district attorney based on circumstantial evidence and Mrs. Reasoner's testimony. Jarvis asked Iverson, "So, without Mrs. B. Reasoner's testimony, would you have filed charges?" Iverson simply replied, "I don't think so. It's hard to say. I would like a little more time to investigate more thoroughly." Jarvis asked, "Are you still investigating this case?" Iverson replied, "No, it's complete on our end." Jarvis thanked him, and he was released. My wife, the prosecution's main witness, was next. Her willingness to completely betray me with her testimony left me shocked, hurt, and humiliated. I could understand her loneliness and frustration, and even her affair because of this. However, the anger, disrespect, and complete disregard for me was something unfathomable. However, her public humiliation of me when she testified against me really had to wait until tomorrow, as the judge adjourned for the evening. I sat in my cell, thinking about how my seemingly wonderful life had gone wrong so quickly. I have never felt so alone, lying on a cot in a prison cell, awaiting the most painful experience of my life. The next morning, after a bowl of cold oatmeal and even colder coffee, I was taken to dress for trial, shackled, and taken to the courthouse. I was placed in a waiting room at the courthouse at 7 a.m. At 8 a.m. Jarvis arrived and prepared me for my wife's testimony, telling me that he had no choice but to do everything in his power to destroy any shred of her trust, and I had to be prepared to remain impassive and not show any emotion that might influence the jury's opinion. The trial began at 9 a.m. The jury took their seats, then the judge, the Honorable Harland B. Ferguson, presided. Harland Ferguson was known as a sharp legal mind, conservative but fair and a true lawyer. No one allowed himself to disrespect his court or the fair and equitable limits of due process and the letter of the law. The prosecutor began questioning Sandy. I sat as calmly as possible while my wife walked up to the podium and took the oath. The prosecutor asked her to tell her version of the events of November 9, 2018. Sandy sobbed and Angela Cascanet told her to take it slow. Sandy pulled herself together again and began to tell her story. She told jurors she dated Dave Rumson for about 2 weeks before November 9, 2018. Our company was throwing a costume party and I was away for work. She decided to go. At a party she met Ramson. He pestered her at a 4th of July picnic and she told him to back off. However, she was looking forward to the party and was angry that her husband, the accused, could not go. She said she started drinking more than usual and soon found herself drunk. Ramson asked her to dance several times, and she rejected his attempts. But as the night grew longer and her level of intoxication increased, she finally agreed to dance with him. He continued to give her water, and by the end of the evening, he offered to take her home. When they arrived at her house, he kissed her and she tried to resist, but with her inhibitions lowered by alcohol, she began to respond, but it didn't go beyond kissing. He always knew when her husband was away and called or came during those periods. She liked Ramson and was angry with her husband for leaving frequently. Eventually, she decided to date him while her husband was away. She didn't expect her husband to be home that Friday and invited the victim, Dave Rumson, to her home. They were entering the house when she heard 3 shots and saw Mr. Burrs Rumson unresponsive and lying on the floor. She ran upstairs, locked herself in her room, and called 911, fearing for her life because her husband had just killed her friend. The prosecutor finished, and now it was Jarvis' turn to cross-examine Sandy. Jarvis slowly walked up to the podium where Sandy was sitting. He repeated her testimony. He asked her if she knew what the penalty for perjury was. Sandy looked worried and nodded yes. Jarvis told her she had to answer, and she timidly said yes, she understands. Jarvis asked if she wanted to add anything, and Sandy said no. Then he started asking questions. He asked her, "Did you please Mr. Rumson on October 27, 2018, in his truck outside your home after he drove you from a party you were at earlier that evening? Remember, you are under oath." Sandy answered quietly, "Yes." Jarvis then asked, "Mrs. Reasoner, did you do the same thing on October 30th in the parking lot of the Revolutions nightclub, on November 5th in your car parked at the Starlight Bar, and again in your garage right before the shooting?" Sandy began to cry and shook her head no before covering her face with her hands. Jarvis asked her again for her answer. Sandy replied, Jarvis struck. "Your Honor, I request leave to consider Mrs. Reasoner a hostile witness and ask the judge to compel the witness to answer." Judge Ferguson said, "The request is granted. Miss, I understand that you feel humiliated, but you must answer the question or I will hold you in contempt of court, and you will be held in the county jail until you comply with my instructions." "Got it, Mrs. Reasoner." Sandy replied, "Yes, Your Honor. To your question, Mr. Jarvis, yes." He asked her if she had sex with Mr. Bose Rumson, and she flatly replied, "No, I never had sex with Mr. Rumson." Jarvis asked, "However, you visited Mr. Rumson's apartment several times. Did you ever stay overnight?" Sandy replied, "No, never." Jarvis continued, "Are you sure you never had sex with Mr. Rumson during these visits?" "Yes, I'm sure. I never had sex with him." Jarvis continued, "Mrs. and Reasoner, you have admitted to exactly what you were doing in your garage before the shooting. Isn't it true that you were removing the seats of your car when the shots were fired and you couldn't see the shooting happening? Also, isn't it true that you never checked your messages? Where would you have discovered that your husband was supposed to be home that evening?" Sandy said in court that what Jarvis said was true. "Mrs. Reasoner, wasn't your plan for November 9th for Mr. Rumson to stay the night because you decided to have sex with him?" Sandy mumbled and finally answered, "Yes." Jarvis asked. Mrs. Reasoner, did you know that your husband carried a 9M Taurus pistol for self-defense? Sandy replied, yes, he had that gun for 2 years and carried it with him almost always. Jarvis said, let me sum it up, Mrs. Reasoner. You had an affair for over 2 weeks with the victim, which was supported by video evidence and witness statements. The affair was secret, and you deliberately deceived your husband and broke your marriage vows with the victim. You didn't check your voicemails on your home phone, your cell phone, or your email, so you didn't know your husband would be home. You then brought the victim into your home with the intention of sex while your husband was at work. Is that right? Sandy replied, yes. By your own admission, your husband was away frequently during this period, and your only contact with Mr. Rumson was during his absence. So it is unlikely that your husband knew about this affair, given that he planned to spend the evening with you that day. Considering all of this, the facts presented in the evidence, and your own affidavit, how can you be sure that my client shot Mr. Rumson with premeditation and malice when, according to your own testimony, you could not have seen him? The truth is that the events that occurred on the evening of November 9 occurred as my client described. Did he just shoot what he thought was an intruder entering his house? Sandy replied, yes, it's possible. Would you say it's even probable, Mrs. Reasoner? Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Jarvis leads the witness to answer, said the prosecutor. Jarvis responded before the judge could make a decision. I withdraw my previous question, Your Honor. The judge instructed the jury to ignore the question. Jarvis continued, Mrs. Reasoner, a couple of last questions. You were in the garage a few minutes after you arrived home and after you sent the defendant ahead. Your husband's truck was parked inside the garage in its usual spot. Is that correct? Yes, Sandy answered. Jarvis then asked, if his truck was in the garage, you should have at least suspected that your husband was home. You admitted that you knew that he carried a gun for self-defense, and that, according to various testimonies and his own words, he did not have any idea about your affair with the victim. If you suspected that your husband might be in the house and knew that he would respond to the intrusion, is that not the reason why you insisted that your lover enter the house? Isn't it true that you actually planned the murder of your lover? Objection, District Attorney Caskinet shouted. Judge Ferguson said, objection granted, Mr. Ducey Jarvis. I will not tolerate cheap theatrical effects in my trial. Jury, disregard the last question. Jarvis simply replied, I apologize to the court, Your Honor, and withdraw the matter. I have no further questions. The district attorney looked a little confused and finished her speech. Judge Ferguson adjourned for lunch. It was 11:30 a.m. I was taken to the conference room where Mom and Dad were. They brought me a huge sandwich from Jimbo's Deli, and I ate it while Jarvis told me about the witnesses who would testify about my character and the video footage from the 2 clubs and the testimony. As I ate the last bite of my sandwich, I thought about how much I wanted this to end once and for all. In court, a series of witnesses began who confirmed my character as an honest and decent person and a fair and reasonable leader. Rumson's foreman, Bill Gower, testified that I could have fired Rumson on the spot, but I asked him to warn him that his behavior would not be tolerated, and nothing went beyond that day except Rumson's warning. Sam witnessed my arrival and how we worked to finish the job. He regretted how I bought the whole crew lunch and gave him $500 to buy drinks for when the crew came home to celebrate, and how he organized a small bus to make sure everyone got home safely. He added that he knew about my plans to come home and celebrate by taking Sandy out to dinner. Connie testified that I was thrilled when I called and asked her to make a last-minute dinner reservation. She told Jarvis about ordering champagne from a restaurant and having roses delivered to our house to celebrate the bonus and promotion I received. She also told him about a $500 gift certificate for her and her husband and said they used it to celebrate their 25th wedding anniversary. Jarvis then introduced the video footage into evidence and interviewed witnesses. At 3 a.m. he completed his part. The judge adjourned and told lawyers that closing arguments would begin at 9 a.m. I was shackled and sent back to my cell in the county jail. That night, after forcing myself to swallow the almost inedible stew, I lay down on my bunk. I understood that my future would soon be decided. I thought Jarvis did a great job, but I doubted it would be enough. Soon a restless sleep came over me. The next morning, Angela Cascanet summed up her case. Her argument was that although the case was largely based on circumstantial evidence, there were too many coincidences for any reasonable person to believe that the murder of David Rumson was anything other than a cold, calculating plan to get rid of his wife's lover for good. The evidence and testimony heard at trial left no reasonable doubt that this was murder, and the jury should have returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. However, Jarvis effectively destroyed the credibility of Sandy's testimony and made me look like a victim in the eyes of the jury. Her summary didn't mention Sandy or her testimony directly, and even I could see that what she thought was a surefire case when the trial began was all but lost. Jarvis attacked the sloppy police work, the neglect of evidence that proved the witness didn't actually see anything. He referred to the shaky nature of Sandy's testimony and added, "My client has given an accurate account of the events, and this is supported by the evidence and testimony of numerous witnesses." He continued by saying that the prosecution's case had more holes than Swiss cheese. The witness was unreliable, and the circumstantial evidence supported my client's case. Thus, sufficient reasonable doubt existed, and having established such doubt beyond rebuttal, the jury had no choice but to acquit my client of the charge of murder in the first degree. He concluded that while Mr. Rumson's murder was tragic and could have been prevented, his client was simply defending his life and home. The jury began deliberating at 10:05 a.m. The verdict was returned at 3:15 p.m. I was brought back from the conference room to receive my verdict. The jury entered the courtroom at 3:25 p.m. and Judge Ferguson opened proceedings at 3:27 p.m. The bailiff handed him the verdict, and he read it before returning it to the jury foreman. The judge ordered me to stand, and Jarvis stood with me. Judge Ferguson asked, "Madam Chief, have you reached a verdict?" She stood up and said, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Henry Andrew Reasoner, not guilty of first-degree murder." Judge Ferguson thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. He then turned to me and said, "Mr. Kenter Reasoner, I recommend that you seek help from a psychologist to cope with the stress of having to kill another person. Even if it was justified, it can be difficult to live with, especially since an innocent person's life was lost in the incident, which further adds to the stress and guilt. Given the tragic nature of this incident and other traumas, I hope you receive help and find a measure of peace and stability in your life. You are being reported to the county jail for immediate release. You'll be home for dinner. This case is closed." I gave away everything I had brought with me and put on the suit I wore at the trial to return home. I noticed that Sandy did not appear in court after closing arguments. I couldn't deal with the mess my marriage had become. Mom and Dad picked me up at the prison exit as soon as I became a free man again. All I wanted to do was eat normal food, drink a cold beer, and sleep. They took me to their home. Tomorrow I wanted to celebrate, and the next day mourn all that was lost. Dave Rumson was a scoundrel, but his seduction of my wife and their cheap secret affair did not deserve a death sentence. My family and friends, with the exception of Sandy, came to congratulate me with a great barbecue and a lot of beer. I was truly grateful for all their support and good wishes. Dad paid me my entire salary while I was in prison, and he wouldn't let Sandy touch it. I took a couple of weeks to recover and get used to the world before returning to work. I went to a lodge on Lake Massawippi for some solitude and fishing. I just returned from the lake due to thunderclouds that suddenly covered me. I entered the house and was just in time before the downpour started. I took off my jacket and fishing vest and turned towards the main room to see her. Sandy was sitting on the sofa. I noticed that she had lost weight and looked exhausted to some extent. Her red eyes and tear marks showed that she had been crying while she was sitting there. It took her a moment to notice that I had entered the house from the back door and to look in my direction. She had the look of a deer caught in headlights, and whatever had brought her here, It was clear that her resolve was gone, and if she could, she would have run out of the room and into the storm. She was paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, a large bolt of lightning struck a tree about 100 yards from the house, and the ensuing thunder shook the walls. Sandy jumped up and ran towards me, hugging me. Instinctively, I hugged her back and held her until she stopped shaking. The storm passed quickly, and as the thunder began to subside in the distance across the lake, I let her go and sat her back down on the couch. I started the conversation. "Sandy, why are you here?" She looked at me with her big blue eyes and said, "Henry, I wanted to apologize." I looked at her in disbelief that after everything that had happened, she dared to think that an apology would fix anything, or had the audacity to try to apologize. I asked her, "What do you want to apologize for?" "For not understanding that I suffered as much or more than you did when I had to work on business trips. That I did this, by the way, for the sake of our family, which we were planning to start." "Are you apologizing for breaking our marriage vows and getting involved with David Rumson? Are you apologizing for getting caught? Are you apologizing because I killed your lover, or were you planning for me to kill him with my own hand and for me to end up in prison for life?" She cried, "No, I love you, Henry." Shocked, I replied, "Did you love me so much that you had an affair with one of our employees? Did you love me so much that you believed I committed murder? Did you love me so much that you refused to talk to me? It was love that made you voluntarily testify against me? Do you just hate men, or is it just me that you hate and despise so much? You never gave the man you claimed to love a chance to explain yourself. You wanted me to spend the rest of my life behind bars, and you did everything you could to put me there. Whatever it was, there was no love in the equation, and it was proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. Go away. The next time I see you, it will be in court, divorce court." I went out the back door. A rainbow appeared over the lake as I reflected on the last 2 years, years filled with unhappiness, betrayal, and fear. The rainbow meant that one door had closed, and perhaps one day another would open. I headed out for an afternoon of fishing. Finally, both literally and metaphorically, the storm passed. I couldn't believe what Henry just said. I sat there in shock as he walked out the back door and heard the boat's engine start and the propeller churning the lake water, leaving me behind in his wave. After a while, I realized that my marriage was over, so I got up and walked out the front door. The large oak tree was still smoking from the lightning strike, symbolizing my marriage. As I drove back to the city, I thought about what had happened. I was so full of anger at my husband that I allowed myself to believe that he was ignoring my needs and desires. I allowed my anger and loneliness to fester. I went to that party filled with rage and drank so much that my inhibitions were lowered to the point that I allowed myself to cheat on my husband. I continued to cheat on him and felt it was justified considering how neglected I was. I brought my lover to our house and planned to have sex with him in our marital bed. I was so self-absorbed that I didn't even notice Henry's truck in the garage. I panicked when I heard the shots and ran into the house. I blamed myself, but my guilt quickly turned to anger, and I accused my husband of murder. To hide my guilt and shame, I continued to blame him, claiming that he had killed my friend, and even tried to get him found guilty to avoid my responsibility for the events that unfolded on that tragic evening in November. By the time I realized what I had done, and that I really loved my husband, it was already too late. Although David Rumson's death was a tragic accident, I ended my marriage. Why did I try to make amends? Nothing could justify my behavior. I drove to the bridge where the Mononoke River flows into Lake Massawippi. I decided to hold my own trial, stopping in the middle of the bridge. I pleaded guilty and was sentenced to death. I got out of the car and climbed onto the steel support of the old bridge. I looked up to the sky and asked forgiveness for my past and present sins. The sun was slowly setting as I jumped off the bridge and plunged into the icy waters that began in the mountain springs that fed the lake. Darkness swallowed me as I sank into the depths of the murky water, ready to surrender to the mercy of death. However, the vibration disturbed the calm of the lake around me, and suddenly I felt a powerful hand that pulled me out of my watery grave. I blacked out as I burst to the surface, not understanding how or why I had been forgiven or who had overturned my sentence. I decided to go to the pier to refuel the boat and buy groceries. I was entering a wave-free area when I saw a figure standing high on a pillar of the 1920s bridge that crossed the entrance to the lake. Suddenly, the body jumped from the bridge and plunged into the cold water. I turned the engine on full blast and quickly got to the place where the body entered the water. I grabbed the man by the jacket and pulled him to the surface. When the body broke the surface of the water, I saw that it was a woman, and almost instantly I knew that it was Sandy. I pulled her ashore and performed CPR until she started breathing again. I called 911 and she was taken to the hospital. She was placed under psychiatric observation and then court-ordered to undergo therapy to treat her depression and help her cope. She spent 6 months in treatment, but left it with an understanding of what she had done, some conclusions about the reasons for her behavior, and mechanisms for accepting and coping with what happened. I filed for divorce. I felt a little malice towards her. I was disappointed by the shallowness she showed in getting involved with Rumson, and mostly I felt a huge amount of regret and loss. I paid for her treatment and even attended some sessions to understand her behavior. Judge Ferguson turned out to be a wise man. He realized that I needed help before I did. I sought help from a psychologist to cope with the events of recent years. Sandy's therapist noticed the warning signs and referred me to a colleague. Dr. Sean McMahon diagnosed me with PTSD. I have been undergoing separate treatment to deal with this. Intensive care ended for both of us several months ago, although we both continue to monitor our condition. Sandy admitted that although I had forgiven her, we could never be together again. We divorced amicably. The final divorce verdict came in the mail 6 weeks ago. Sandy met a good man, a teacher named John. They have been dating for 3 months now, and it looks like their relationship is heading towards marriage. I was left alone. I wanted to sort out my problems. At the moment, the thought of loving and trusting another woman is difficult for me to comprehend. I can't complain because I am truly and unconditionally loved by my mom and dad. Without them, I would be locked out with the key thrown away. They provided me with emotional and financial support throughout this entire ordeal. I took over the housing division last year and am also the vice president of the company. I have great friends. I fish, boat, hunt, attend barbecues, and oversee the company picnic and Christmas party. My social calendar is pretty full. For Christmas, I sent my mom and dad on a trip around the world. I also wanted to thank them for everything they have done for me and for always being there for me. I managed the company's affairs while they were away. I recently met a woman named Amelia who, like me, is divorced and has trust issues. I met her while waiting for my therapy session to begin. She came to the meeting with her support group. So far, we've only had coffee, but I felt a spark. I knew I wasn't ready for a new relationship yet, but the other day I asked her out to dinner and she said yes. I must completely close the door to my past. How long this will take, if ever, remains unknown. If that day comes, then perhaps another door will finally open. Only time will tell. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one.